So as you can see, the title of this slideshow is The History of an Idea. And we'll get into what that idea is as we go. I'd like to say one thing first, though. I think a person will notice as the way I describe the story that I see a certain amount of destiny in this story, and I believe that it is a story of destiny, and the way that shapes how I look upon it, and so the way I tell it too is that this isn't the story of the shaping of myself, like in pop psychology, where you're the sum of your experiences. It's the story of an idea that's shaping the itself. It's sort of like the idea itself is trying to be born into the world and creates the circumstances that will find it. Now that sounds strange, but that is the way my mind works. That is how I see life. I see the purpose as part of the cause. So you could say where something is going is part of what is driving it to that destination. That's a very purpose-driven vision of reality, but that's my vision of reality. Okay, I just wanted to say that because I think it'll be evident as I tell this. First of all, I was born in Kingston, New York, and was brought home to this sort of strange-looking church house in Woodstock in 1959, and this was the house that as the caption says, the Otts and Seifs lived here from 1958 to 1966 before we moved to the Mayer Spiritual Center in South Carolina. And my story begins in this house. Okay, first of all, one of the things that clearly was kind of unavoidable influence is that both my mother and my father were artists. And that's my mother, Phyllis, on the left, my father, Linfield, on the right, in their studios in Woodstock. And I used to march over to the studio with my dad. Now my dad was losing his eyesight. He had retinitis pigmentosa, which is a degenerative congenital eye disease that you're born with. And he knew about it all his life, and that he would eventually go blind. So our family was, because he was the primary breadwinner, and because he made his money painting, which required eyesight, sort of like the bread and butter of the family hinged on his sight. So you can imagine how much attention there was, at least some of us, on his vision. And so vision becomes a kind of a theme from the very beginning because of that. Now, this is me about the age that my mother said she first observed that when we would go through a doorway, because I was aware of my father's blindness, he had tunnel vision, which made it hard for him to see in the peripheral vision, so he could bump into things and injure himself. So she noticed that when we would go through a doorway, even at this age, I would turn around and look up and make sure he could clear the doorway because he was tall. And besides this showing an unusual amount of empathy for a small boy, it also shows a awareness of how another person sees. Well, that becomes a big part of this whole story. Most people don't think about that sometimes in their whole life. I'll get into that. Now, when I was about 12 years old, a story that started out sad, got happier, was that I went to a place called Pirate Land, which was a lot of amusements for kids. Without my parents, I forget who took us, the kids. And there was a light show. It was actually black light. And the people danced in sort of day-glow colors on the stage. It kind of flickered, very bright, intense colors like orange and blue and stuff in this light show dance. And then while I was sitting there, I thought, man, wow, this is so clear. It was clear, like a cartoon is clearer than a photograph because it just has less information, and it's a caricature of what we see. So I figured it was easier to see. So I thought, oh, my dad should see this. He would love this. He'd be able to see this. So I told my parents, and to their great happiness and delight, they came. My mother was actually excited to take Dad, and it was very nice, respectful to me. And I might have been, I don't know, I might have been 10 years old. I don't know how old I was. But they went to the light show, and then afterward, my dad was very disappointed, and they shyly explained to me that Dad couldn't see a thing in the room because it was too dark. So that kind of shook me up, and that I had been that wrong. And so I thought about it more, and I thought about the fact that it was too dark, and other things I knew. I knew he had tunnel vision, which means you can only see a narrow area in the center of your field of vision. And so I got out a pair of sunglasses, and I went into the studio when no one was there, and I painted onto the lenses of these sunglasses. They weren't as dark as these in the picture. They were very light. But I darkened the whole perimeter so that there was a spot in each one that you can see through, small, so to create the illusion of the tunnel vision. And then through putting glaze, I tried to duplicate the sense of things being fuzzy, and also that muted the color. So when my parents got home, I showed these to them, and they immediately started experimenting with them at the dinner table, and with my mom posing in front of, we would put them on and we would report what we saw, and that was what my father saw. And there was a lot of excitement because my mother especially saw use to the classes. She had always wanted her parents to understand Lynn's disease, and she took these with her in a purse to Boston. They were very enthusiastic about the Lynn Ott classes that I had made, and so I was very proud. But anyway, she took these to Boston, and she tried to show these to her parents, and her mother got very angry, and she said that she felt persecuted that Phyllis was trying to make her see the way Lynn sees, which was fascinating to my mother, and still fascinates me too. I think that's fascinating, that someone would be so resistant and feel persecuted by such a thing. How dare you ask me to see how someone else sees? Oh my God. So that again, I hope this person sees the theme. The first of the doorway, how does Dad see? This one again, wanting to know how he saw. At that point, I understood very well how my father saw, and then got better as I got older. Now, when I was 15 years old, I decided I wanted to read some of Baba's work. So I took God Speaks down to the boathouse. That's that picture here is of me at that age. And I read the first chapter, which is only 8 pages long, and in the boathouse. And then I thought about it, and I didn't understand it. And I asked my parents about it, and both of them were thoughtful people who had read the book, and of course, and they explained it a little to me, and this is how they explained it. in those days, contact looked like this. Today it looks it looks different. But in those days, there were these capsules, and you could open them up and pour out the little beads. And we had contact, for when we had a cold. But this just comes into it in a moment. They explained that the idea of the ocean and the drops, which didn't really make any sense to me at the time, and I think my dad said it's like a drop of the ocean, which represents God, okay, is encapsulated, and that's your soul. So those objects up here, they're souls in this metaphor, okay, and and that he said that what encapsulated them was their sanskaras, their impressions, encapsulated them and created the sense of separation. Well, so I thought about this. This is beneath the surface of water. And I thought about this, and in my later thinking about it, I imagined a contact. And I take a contact, I didn't actually do this, I just thought about it, to get the idea. And you pour out the little beads, and then you put it underwater, and then close it, and you would encapsulate a bit of the ocean. Now, later, I might talk about what I later learned is messed up about that analogy. However, it's not that Baba messed it up, it's something that we all miss when we read it. But I'm going to get to that much later. But that's as far as I got at that age, 15. That's as far as I got. I had that to ponder over the years that followed. And now, I went to college, and certain courses interested me very deeply. And the next thing that influenced my mind forever was at the University of South Carolina, I studied physical anthropology. That means the evolution of the species. Okay, so evolution, Darwinian evolution, and then of course the various hominids that eventually reach what we are supposed to be in the prodigy of, or our ancestors. And I did very well because I was so interested. It captured my imagination. And I understood evolution very well. When I talk to people now, because I say such strange things, they think I don't understand it. They start explaining it. No, I understand it very well. But there were things that I saw that were major problems. And if I'm going to say them now because it's the purpose of this video, but some people will a lot of people will object. But people object to most of my ideas. It's not, I don't think like other people. I don't ask permission to think. One time I told a person a thought which was very new and original, and he said, well, I don't think anybody would agree with you on that, have that position. It's like, no, you don't even know what an idea is. It's like, it's not an idea unless it's old. No. So anyway, the thing that I noticed when I was studying evolution was that evolution was not actually happening. Things in nature that exist now existed millions of years ago, tens of millions of years ago. And that all the species in nature that we study are actually adapted to their environment, including baboons and any animal you can name, okay? They are very well adapted to their environment. There's no failure in adaptation. And I also felt that the understanding, so that was the thing, I felt that evolution is not happening, that evolution must have happened in bursts, And I also, because I understood even just through osmosis a little more of God Speaks by then, I was about, 18 years old. Um, I, I had this idea that evolution is pushed from within. And so, that was another thing. And I had kept these thoughts with me for a long time. A couple of years later, I came upon a Life magazine article. It was published in 1981 or 1982. And on the cover is a pistol, because it's about gun laws. And the article said exactly what I thought, but it was like a renegade thought. The person was saying that actually when Darwin did his experiments, wrote his book and organized his systematized his evolution, they had a very small fossil record because that field of was so new. But today, well, we're talking 1981. At that time, there's a huge fossil record, and the fossil record does not show what Darwin described it should. It does not show all these different in-betweens and all sort of like that. Instead, it shows like there are whole warehouses and museums containing multi-million, 10 million years old rhinoceros bones. Like nothing happened to rhinoceroses. Now, if you look at it like this, you'll see that it's true. You look at a dragonfly 100 million years ago. The only difference is its size, which is not, that's very important that it's its size. See, when we talk about a species in Bob, okay, we mean a form. And a form, you can look it up, it's an etymology, means a shape. The shape is the same. So whether an alligator, a billion years ago was larger, it's still exactly the same form. So that's important. So now, some years later, I ended up with my daughter, Megan, and there's just the two of us. Her mom had problems, so I took her on my own, and when she was 1 year old, she's a little less than one here, so it's a few months old, but when she turned 1, I took her and we head out and we went into the middle of the country. I wanted to raise her away from the influence of other people's ideas. I wanted to raise her myself and teach her myself the things I had learned in my life. And that was, I especially wanted to take her away from the Baba community and my family, and raise her where she would know me as her primary adult influence. And I did, and we went to Arkansas. And so this picture sort of represents us hitting the road together. And we got out to Arkansas, and what did I discover is this beautiful university. It's the main campus of the University of Arkansas, known for their Razorbacks. It's the first home of Bill and Hillary Clinton. Bill Clinton taught law school there. Now, this building here is called Old Main. And when I discovered this beautiful university and the Old Main, I fell in love with it. And I also fell in love with the married student housing, which Megan and I qualified for. It means family student housing, but they call it married. So I felt this would be a wonderful way to be able to raise Megan, is in the shelter of a university life. I like the living quarters, which I'll talk about more, and I just love the campus, and it's a very good university. Now, um, I applied initially. I still wanted to continue with my thoughts about anthropology and evolution. So I applied. I was going to apply to the anthropology department, but the head of the department discouraged me and said there were no jobs and stuff. And so I was kind of older too. I think that's probably why they were more cautious to tell me the bad news. I was almost 40. I was about 39 by this time. So, and I had my degree from my bachelor's I had. So I was looking at graduate schools. So the next thought is I thought of philosophy. Now, it's funny, but one of the reasons I thought of philosophy was simply there was a short list of departments that were kind of easy to get into because you didn't have to take I think it's called the GRE, or the graduate entrance exam. And I had already taken it years before, and I just wanted to skip it. And philosophy, they didn't require it. They required a letter, they required an essay, they required good grades, which I had. And so I decided to walk in and talk to the head of the philosophy department. And I knew nothing about philosophy. Now, the day I went to there, it was snowing, and it's the only day I ever remember seeing Old Main in the snow. And it was glistening. It was the day the sun was out. It was glistening. And as I walked up to the front door, it was like Christmas. The ice crystals were shining with the light through them like prisms. And I thought, well, this is auspicious. I'm supposed to go here, because it was so beautiful. Well, sure enough, the head of the department, he said he was much more open than the anthropology department. He warned me that there's not many jobs in teaching philosophy, and that's about all you can do. And but I wanted to get into school for other reasons, so he was willing to accept my application, and I got in. And then, as soon as I was accepted, I went to the married student housing, and I got to say something about that place. I maybe this doesn't have to do with my idea, but it's part of the story. At that time at the university, they had these beautiful buildings called Carlson Terrace. And amazingly, they were designed by the designer of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, MoMA, and Edward Durrell Stone, who also designed the John F. Kennedy Center in New York, and it's just a huge genius of an architect. But these buildings were modernist, and by then they were old, but I loved them, and this feeling of protection, I just loved it. It was so wonderful for turning one's attention away from the world and focusing on ideas, which I've always loved to do. Now, this is Megan and I at Carlson Terrace during those happy years. Now, I began studying philosophy, and as I started studying philosophy, I, for the first time, heard these very powerful questions that had always been with humanity and boggled very great minds, and I just was amazed. I'd never heard of these things. It was so fantastic to me. But I have to admit that I started having, once I started being just exposed to these questions, I started to have a kind of experience, but not a hallucination or something, but a theme kept pressing on my thoughts, and it was the old way was in, like those arrows there, and the new way, something like we're about to move into some new way, was the arrows going out. I would draw this over and over, and I would apply this to various contexts, the same theme. Now, I'll try to explain what this is. And I would say there's a new way of looking at things which is inside out of the old way. Now, the terrible thing about saying that is you sound crazy. You do. And I don't talk like that anymore. If anybody's listened to my recent talks, I don't use such undeveloped language, but it was the way it felt to me. Now, what I meant was that, and I could say it was from the minimal exposure to Baba's ideas, possibly, probably, almost certainly. But the idea was that the world is not coming at us like it feels to our senses, like sound coming to your ears and into your brain and stuff like that. Although physically that's true. Metaphysically, in some sense that I couldn't articulate, it was the reverse. That things were coming out of you. Now it's very, very important to make a distinction here, because if you think the world is emanating from yourself in the sense of your own ego, that's called solipsism. And it's not a condition that people are diagnosed with, but it's like a theoretical condition. It's a philosophical, it's like zombieism. It's a philosophical concept that of a way you could be looking at the world that nobody really has, but it would be crazy. And that would be that the whole world is in your head. And so the people that you're talking to are in your head. The earth is in your head. Anybody you meet is in your head. This is sort of like you yourself are God and the whole world is just in your imagination. That's called solipsism. It's also called subjectivism. One person in history was accused of having this, but didn't actually. But his name was George Berkeley, for whom the city of Berkeley in California is named after. And Berkeley has been called, he never called himself this, a subjective idealist. So the world is just subjective ideas in your mind. Well, this isn't not what he said, but it's just a very, very poor reading of Berkeley. But I did my thesis on Berkeley, so I know a lot about it. Anyway, I would say the world is inside out. And then I would have this other thing I would say, which sounded really crazy, when I heard talk of mind and body, or like the physical, meaning chairs in the room, and then the mental, like thoughts in your head, I would describe that we should back up one more step, because they seem to have this dichotomy in Western philosophy that I was reading. So I said, and I shouldn't have because people thought I was crazy. I mean, in the department, I said this. I said, we think of mind and body, but really, like, these are the objects in the room, these are our thoughts, but really we should step one more step back into consciousness, because we're conscious of both. Now, that was too much to even hear, like to even see a person, stepping around in the room was too much. I was a little too much candor. However, there's some truth to what I just said, and the reason that I had this is because I came with thoughts of consciousness, and then they don't talk like that anymore in philosophy, and I was a little confused by that. Now I wrote here an early version of my writing on my idea was called the consciocentric universe. Consciocentric, in other words, sort of like not rather than geocentric, like earth-centered, or egocentric. It was consciousness was this central radius of everything. Now, these ideas, it turns out, this idea of the arrows going out, I can now say that somehow I had intuited what's called in history of philosophy, emanationism, which was a sort of 2nd century Roman philosophy. Most notable of its proponents was Plotinus, who's not to be confused with Plato. This is Plotinus. He was a follower of Plato after hundreds of years after his life, but he had developed the ideas of Plato, and he had developed an idea that was sort of in the center was the one, and then out from that is mind, and then out from that is matter. So it was very similar. But my professors didn't know anything about Plotinus. Literally didn't know. He's a very hard philosopher to read, and since then I have, and but it's not my specialty, but I know as much as I just said. Now, I want to go further now. So in the beginning, I was starting to have like an idea, but I didn't have the words for the idea. I couldn't even really see my idea, except that more and more it would sort of like unfold before me. Not, again, like a hallucination, but just conceptually. I could see it, but then I couldn't hold on to it and would slip back in. Now, I've talked to other people since where I can convey a lot of my idea to them. And they report the same thing. They say, I see it, and then I can't see it. And that's how it is. It's hard to hold. Now I have a much easier time, because I have language that I didn't have then. Now, I had never studied philosophy before. And here I was on a graduate level. I had to do a lot of work to catch up. I bought an encyclopedia of philosophy terms, words, and I read it cover to cover. And I really read it so that I started building up a vocabulary. That's something I don't think any other student probably ever did. I also had to take a couple classes just to qualify for the graduates department. Now, when I sat down and began to listen to lectures in philosophy, because I was away from the Meher Center and my parents and all the people who had influenced me, and it was just me and Megan. Megan supported me. I mean, I felt very strongly at Carlson Terrace. I felt confident to let go of all the things I'd ever assumed, even from Baba. I mean, all of it. They pointed out that, like, one guy said, "What is consciousness?" Like in an accusational way. And then it hit me. Why do I have to be stuck on that? Get over it. I mean, there was part of, he was sort of being an asshole, but there was truth in it too. What is consciousness? I had to think about that a lot. Consciousness has very many meanings in philosophy. And so it's very reckless to just start talking about consciousness. Like people who don't have a rigorous education in philosophy. You hear it all the time in New Age. Consciousness. That's kind of like where I began with my conscious-centric universe. I look back on that as, 50% inspiration and 50% total nonsense. Before I had let go of enough of my past. But I was ready to just give up God. Okay? Until things started to change. Because right when I was really getting open-minded, and sort of like just let yourself fall like a leaf and see where you go, I learned some amazing things that's sadly nobody knows them. Nobody knows them. So one of the things that I learned, and this is absolutely emphatically true, it's not controversial. It's not like a thing like, oh, well, somebody says that, but somebody doesn't. Nope. It's not uncontroversial, unanimous opinion of Western philosophers that matter under their own paradigm is a theoretical entity It has no basis except what it is, its supposed and theoretical explanatory ability. You see, supposedly information, like in the form of vibrations, come into your ears and come into your eyes and stuff, but you sense those vibrations as sounds and colors, all right? You don't sense the matter. You're sensing some kind of effect of what they, in their thinking, an effect of electrical states in the brain. You're definitely not experiencing the material world. You're experiencing some kind of brain-created representation of it. You have no idea what the cause looks like, smells like, tastes like, because those words don't even apply to it. We don't even have language to describe reality. We only have the language to describe our percepts, our experience. Okay? Percept. If a percipient is that which perceives, the perception is that which he does. The percept is that which he perceives, the object. Okay? Now, so all we have is our brain-created percepts. So in materialism, the world is all in your head. Your world, the world you experience, this is very different than what naive scientists think. They think that they're studying the world through observation. I'm going to get into that more as we go on. Now, so the very accusation that atheists make about God, this exact identical argument is waiting to be made against the atheist. But people don't know enough to do that. And the philosophers aren't going to tell them because they want to be atheists. But if the argument against God is that you can't perceive him and he's just some theoretical cause that doesn't really explain what it's supposed to explain, because so, it's just, the same exact thing can be said of matter, because it's just theoretical. And how it explains your experience, no one has been able to answer. If you have to rewind what I just said and listen to it again, do, because it's very profound. The mind-body problem is, in part, not just that we only perceive our own brain states and not the world, but that we have no idea how this theoretical material world could create those brain states. They can talk about electricity and chemicals moving around in your brain and even point to them, but how that makes experience, conscious experience, they have no answer to it. So it's just as empty epistemologically, as far as how we know, it's just as uncertain as theism. Materialism, theism, on the same ground, none at all. They're both sort of like hanging loosely on some words. They don't really have any real explanatory power. Now, this made me, if you look at the bottom there, begin to become very skeptical about the world, about what we can know, about everything, and to even become nearly a relativist. So a relativist doesn't even believe there is truth. There's just each person has their own experience of things. So it's a terrible place to get spiritually and intellectually. So I was in a bad place for a while, but I pulled myself out. I had some good teachers. Now, what started pulling? Now I wrote here, Hansen and Kant opened my eyes. Norwood Hansen was a philosopher in the 20th century, in like the 40s. And Hansen, that's him in the picture. He was a stunt pilot and a philosopher and a bit of an artist. And he was, So he's sort of like, but he was like, Yale University. He's a quintus, he's a paradigm scholar too, but he's sort of a rogue. And he developed the field of philosophy, which didn't exist before the 20th century, this philosophy of science. And he incorporated into philosophy of science. Philosophy of science is where you're trying to discover and consider what the methods that science actually uses to come to its conclusion. So you study the methods of science and you formalize them. Our early example of philosophy of science is Occam. Willem of Occam, who created Occam's razor, the idea that the most simple theory is the most likely true. That's a medieval Franciscan friar philosopher. But in the 20th century, philosophy of science jumped way forward. And one of the first was Thomas Kuhn. I did a paper on Kuhn. But gradually, Hansen comes before Kuhn, actually, Kuhn. But Kuhn's even more important. And Kuhn, did I say Hansen? Sorry. Hansen is the most important, I think. Now I'm going to talk about what he said. These drawings, anybody who's listened to me give talks about my philosophy will notice these drawings. These drawings are from Hansen's book. Patterns of Discovery. Obviously, you can just see right away, this could be a face looking this way and a face looking back at it, or it could be a vase. This, I believe, is actually a drawing by Norwood Hansen. It's it's like a Gestalt picture. It's just these lines and then he says, it's a bear climbing a tree. It's really cute. And this is the duck rabbit. This is an earlier version of the duck rabbit from a German newspaper in the 19th century. The idea that this way it's like a duck. That's its beak. That way it's a rabbit, and those are its ears behind it. It's looking that way. This one can be a young woman or an old woman. And this again is ducks and rabbits, I believe. Or swans and rabbits, whatever. Now, what Hansen was getting at was that there's a naive view in science. It's called scientific realism, that doesn't take into account. That's Hansen's airplane. He flew over the San Francisco Bridge on it in a stunt, the Golden Gate. I really like him. He's one of my two or three favorites. Hansen was a pioneer in advancing the argument that observation is theory-laden. Okay? That observation language and theory language are deeply interwoven, and that the historical and contemporary comprehension are similarly deeply interwoven. His single most central intellectual concern was the comprehension and development of a logic of discovery. Okay? In his most famous book, Patterns of Discovery, 1958, the year before I was born, he argues that what we see and perceive is not what our senses receive, but is instead filtered sensory information, where the filter is our existing preconceptions. This is exactly where I took off from. A concept later called a thematic framework, okay? So the theories that that scientists had, Hansen said, framed how they were looking upon things and changed what they thought they found. Okay, so for instance, if you approach something in nature with a particular theory, that theory calls that your thinking is theory laden. That theory is going to affect how you set up your experiments, what you're looking for, what you are interested in, what you ignore, okay, in your observations. So the theory affects the outcome of the experiment. So the experiment is not so objective as people had thought before, because it's being influenced by preconceptions. All right? That was the point of these. You can see one thing as this, or you can see it as that, depending on your preconceptions. All right? Now, this gradually gave rise to what, in my philosophical system, which is unique, and I'm not saying that lightly. It's absolutely never been formulated this way. Okay, it became what I call perceptual schema. Schema means organization, and perception is perception. So how you organize what you experience. You can organize this experience as two faces, or you can organize it as a kind of chalice. If you're really observant and you spend some time looking at it and thinking about it, you'll notice you cannot do both at the same time. You can look at it through one schema, you can look at it through the other, but not both at the same time. So you have to schematize what you see. The same is true with this duck rabbit, or this woman. Here she's an old woman looking down, those are her lips, that's her big nose, that's her curly hair, she has a perm. And then the young woman, that's her perm again, and that's her chin. That's the bottom of her chin, that's her ear. And the old woman, that's her the eye. And the young woman, that's her cheek of the young woman, that's the ear. You can't see both at the same time. Something's happening. You're schematizing it. That's what's happening. You are looking at it through this schema, and then you go, oh, now he wants me to look through it through that schema. Now, the other person that influenced me, who I've already mentioned, and influenced me very, very deeply, I have to say. Besides Immanuel Kant and George and Hansen, George Berkeley influenced me greatly. However, and I did my thesis on Berkeley, and I know Berkeley way ass better than anybody that was in my department. I mean, Berkeley is one of the most misunderstood geniuses. It's really a tragedy. One time I was going to write a book on understanding Berkeley, but I just don't have the physical energy to do it. But it would be really great. Anyway, his books that influenced me are The Principles of Human Knowledge, and another book that's in Latin only, De Motu. And luckily I was able to dig up an English version of De Motu, which was very hard to find. It was always published in Latin, usually in an appendix of some other book. But De Motu, these are on perception. Now, Berkeley said some things that are very dramatic and sort of shocking. And the thing about Berkeley is that to this day, people can't see how to argue against him, and yet they desperately want to. The fighting against Berkeley is part of the whole interest of Berkeley. Berkeley was ridiculed in his time, okay? And he's sort of the quintessential idealist. Okay, that means the world is made of ideas. And that's the language of the Enlightenment. We wouldn't talk that way today. We would say not our ideas, but our percepts, or the qualities of our experience. Um, he never used that word, but I don't want to get because I know so much. I don't want to get into it. But so one of the dramatic things he said is that you only know your experience, that which you perceive. You only have access to your experience. Now, for some reason, since the beginning of time, men had thought in terms of the things that they perceive, and then all that other important stuff we know about. Well, like gods and things, and all kinds of like magical elements and stuff like that. But he points out that all those things that you think you don't perceive, you perceive them in your imagination. You cannot escape your own experience. No matter where you look with your attention, that's your experience. It's so obvious, but they fight it. They say, no. Now remember, we don't experience matter. Okay? I just said that. Matter is a theoretical entity. I said that is not controversial. Anybody who says that's not true doesn't understand the subject. It's not their area. They're not in metaphysics. So he said, abandon it. What do you need it for? Create a system in terms of experience. The world is the experience of the world. This is now much more common since Berkeley, and it's usually called phenomenalism, which is a broad term, which means phenomenon means that which you experience. The phenomenon. Some people think a phenomenon is some strange thing that happened. Well, that's the colloquial use, but it's misuse. The original word means that which is perceived. Anything you experience is phenomenal. Now, so Berkeley called himself an immaterialist. He didn't believe in matter. This has made people so mad, they're still mad. So they call him a solipsist, which is, or a subjective idealist, which he's the only member of this category. You can look it up on Wikipedia. You look up subjective idealism and it'll say, like Berkeley, but it won't name anybody else because it was invented just to ridicule him. So a subjective idealist is a person who thinks the whole world is in his head. But Berkeley was really smart. He wasn't like a moron. So anyway, de motu, he annihilates the concept of powers, okay, which today you might be called energy. There's so much talk about energy. Even the new age is just riddled with energy. Energy, the whole world is fundamentally energy. Show me some energy. You can't. You can't. You can show me some things moving and claim it's because of some energy, but I can't see the energy. It's just like the thing of matter. So, deny that too. Another invisible thing that's not really doing anything for you. Now this is shocking because this is a different way of approaching the universe than most of us are used to. I mean, most people think, a genius is somebody who discovered something new, came up with another thing, or broke one thing into two. So everything's always getting sort of mushrooming like this, bigger and bigger and bigger and more and more and more. This is the sense in which Meher Baba said philosophy is a simple thing made complicated, because they're always trying to add some more stuff. But Berkeley, he's doing the opposite. Now this really interested me because of my consciocentrism thought, okay, which I had before I even knew about Berkeley. See, my feeling was that they're like the emanationists of 2,000 years ago, like Plotinus, that things emerged from the one. See, I wanted to get at what is this one? Now for Berkeley it was God, but his God was very churchy. I do something, but I love it anyway. I love it. Berkeley had made some mistakes, and they're not important. But this is what an influence on my thinking. Okay. Now, I had all these things juggling around in my head while I was going around campus. And I'm about 40 years old. Megan's living, we're very happy at Carlson Terrace. And the bus would pick me up, take me to my classes. And she would go to this Hindu Indian lady who had like 3 or 4 girls that she watched during the day, whose husband was an engineer. And we became very close friends. Me and the parents of the other girls that were Megan's friends, and Shell, her teacher. And so one day I was getting on a bus. This is the campus bus. If you observe it, you'll see the Razorback. Okay, so one day I walked down to the bus stop from my Carlson Terrace, and I walked up to the bus, and its door was open. And I stepped onto the bus, and he closed the door right behind me. And there was no one else on the bus. And this very nice bus driver was there. And he said, "Boy, you're on time." And I said, "Oh, wow, that's great." And he said, "No, you're really on time." He said, "This watch I have is linked to the atomic clock in Colorado, and you walked in on the second when this bus is supposed to leave." I thought that's really interesting. And I throw this in because something was going to happen on that bus. And I put these together and I said the time was right. Okay, so that's just some fun. But one day, shortly after that, funny episode, I used to carry around a notebook because I would get ideas all the time. And, I was thinking. And I had this little red book with me. It was empty. I bought it in the campus bookstore. And had a velvet cover. And I don't know what happened. Looking out the window as we were riding along, boom, the whole idea came in my head. The whole thing, everything, my idea, the whole thing. And I began writing on the first page. This is March 5th, 2000. I began writing on the first page, and I kept going, both sides, all the way to the end. On that one bus ride, it's been a long bus ride, and I concluded, and I wrote 3/15/2000. That's the idea. I kept it. So it's been it's been 20 years. It's now December 2019. And it's still my idea. Now let me read what it says. I fear that it'll sound odd, but I think that's natural. I hadn't figured out how to say this, but I saw it. I saw it. So you see something, and then it takes many words. Okay, and when I say I saw it, meaning I understood and apprehended it, I didn't have a vision. Okay. I know, page 1, I no longer believe in invisible forces, invisible objects, or emanations. By invisible, I mean unperceived. But neither do I believe in visible things. But I do believe they are perceived. I believe in perception itself. What I think can be said truthfully is that which is perceived is perceived. There is no truth outside of perception. Today I would a little bit change that to there is no object outside of perception. So when people talk of being real, this is confused idea. To be real, one would have to be perception itself. Okay. I won't read them more. I'll go back in my treasure box. There's the idea. There's perception itself. And then you account for the existence of the perceived world in all its complexity, including ourselves in it, our bodies, our thoughts, everything, in terms of an evolution of perception itself. Theoretical, ontological objects that are unperceived, magical, what I now call like magical objects or hypostases. These imagined things that are supposed to make, like, cause everything. They're not real. Instead, we replace those objects with a evolution, with a process, and the process is of perception itself. Now, this idea of explaining the universe as a story or a process or an evolution is the name of two scripts by Baba, at least two. I think they used it over and over when Baba in the 1930s was working on a movie. The title was always How It All Happened. How it happened. How it all happened. See the difference? In God Speaks, Baba describes one of the main chapters of the book, the evolution of consciousness. Baba once said, it's always good to keep in mind that the evolution is an evolution of consciousness, and that the beginning is a beginning in consciousness. And if there ever is going to be an end, it'll be an end in consciousness. Okay. Now, I read those things after I had this idea. Long after I had this idea, I turned to Baba's books and read them cover to cover. All right. But once I did that, I realized, my God, we've been misunderstanding Baba all these years. Because we've been thinking inside out. All right. After writing that little book, I sat down because I had my classes, but when you're in graduate school, there's a lot of time. And I had the summer. And I did paint, though. But I wrote. And I wrote for hours a day, and I wrote for about a year, developing this idea. And these notes are bound in a book called, which I call Notes on Philosophy. And it has a dedication to my daughter and the flyleaf. This is Notes on Philosophy. And yeah, so it's double columned, very small font, so it's the equivalent of 1,200 pages in about 400. Because I put about 4 pages on a page. And to save, and this was only a portion of my notes, but it was a portion that I felt like was representative enough of that period in case my daughter ever wants to have a record of that. Now, shortly after that beautiful place, the evolution of, Carlson Terrace, that beautiful place, was torn down just after we moved out. Now, I think that's amazing. See, it was torn down. It's as if it had waited from the 50s or the 40s for us to live there. And now it's gone. Now, after that, I had a girl, that's my girlfriend of the time, Allison. And you can't tell, but because I look happy and I got everybody in the world. I got lots of love. But you see in the bottom there a painting. Well, my back finally gave out from work. I was under a lot of stress, and my back went out. And on the right, I'm in a lot of pain. I'm in a lot of pain on that couch. I'm in a lot of pain in that picture. And that's why Megan is hugging me, because I smiled. She got me to smile. But I was in a lot of pain for a long time, for 2 years. And during that time, I had to go on disability. But because of that, and my girlfriend left me, because what was I good for? So Megan and I moved into a place called Carl Myers Apartments. Very cheap, on the cheap side of town. And there I recovered from my back as best I could. And I couldn't work, so I grew my hair out. And then I had so much time to think calmly for the first time. Here I am in my 40s, and I have this time to think. Megan took that picture at Carl Myers Apartments. And then I wrote my little book, The Evolution of Perception and the Cosmology of Substance. And as Megan took that, that's her bedroom, her posters. It's all there. There's the book. And I'm going to read the back of it, even though it's a little long. This was my view at that time. This is 2004. Long ago, before he had the complicated metaphysical theories that he has today, man had his experience to explain. Over time, he invented theoretical entities to explain his experience. He invented gods, the logos, forms, matter, monads, noumenon, mind, spirit, the ether, space-time, superstrings, dimensions, etc. Gradually, these invented things became the things which required explaining. Great arguments were generated to explain them, to prove the existence of the entities he had invented to explain experience. Gradually, man began to question experience itself, since it no longer seemed compatible with his theories. Experience, that event which had once been beyond dispute and the starting point of man's inquiry, was now the theoretical entity. And his invented entities, such as matter and energy, for which he had no direct evidence, were reality. The world was finally totally upside down. Chris Ott considers our current philosophical problems to be the tragic result of psychological fallacies as old as Plato. He offers a new explanation for the universe that relies simply on an evolution of perception. His theory succeeds at accounting for the physical as well as the psychological, including mathematics, natural law, concrete objects, language, thought, and culture. A spellbinding journey to the roots of our assumptions. So that's a good description of the book. Now, at the time, some of the things that I wrote in that book, I now have changed my mind, and I'll just name them briefly here. The main thing that changed is that once at that time, I disparaged reliance on intuition as anthropocentric. Like, why should if we have certain intuitions, like mathematical intuitions or something like that, or things we consider to be a priori, like A is either exists or doesn't exist, or something like that. Well, why should we assume that those are true? Wouldn't that be anthropomorphic? In other words, we find them in our own selves. Why are we so special? Okay, so I was a pure skeptic, okay, and very close still to being a relativist. Hence, I made my system consistent with relativity and other aspects of the new counterintuitive science. See, the new science has abandoned, like me, it has abandoned our intuitions. Today, I have recanted, and okay, so at the time, I believe the only thing we can know for certain is that things appear as they do, like in my little red book. One could make no inference from it, I said. There is a lot of depth in that, and it is almost right, but it is insufficiently developed. I now disavow the new science, meaning things like relativity, and champion intuition as the only firm path to truth. So I'm 180 degrees on intuition. That's a major change in my writing, and that's talked about in my series, Talks with Carrie, that are recent. And it's pretty well just talked about in parts 10 and 11. But also it's being more developed even as we speak. So, and that's not my last word. I've got one more book before I leave this world, and I hope to have it developed, and I'm developing it with a friend in South America. We're both working on it. Because I follow intuition, I am now much more certain of my system itself. I no longer qualify that it is ad hoc or even theoretical, but that it has to be so, and I base that on our mutual intuitions. So it's a very big change since 2004, just in the last 5 years. I have also expanded what I mean by perception to be much more like God, and that also I go over in Talks with Carrie. And I don't think anywhere else really. I think that's really new, in which I incorporate the concept of the infinite intelligence without breaking with my monism of perception. It's kind of interesting how it's done. And now we are done. I thank you for watching, and I hope this was at least a little bit enjoyable, and maybe I'll add another piece to this at a later time. Take care, have a wonderful day.